Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about four voices, four-part writing in music. This is the very beginning, so we're going to just really start from scratch and assume that you know absolutely nothing about this. Okay, so for this, let's take, for example, that we've basically been just analyzing chords in a very closed position. Let's say, for example, C, E, G. But now we want to write this in such a way that it could be performed by four different instrumentalists or four different singers of various voice parts. Something that might look a little bit more like this, for example. Okay. Now these two examples look very different. They sound very different as well, but they can both be analyzed as a one chord in the key of C major, or in lead sheet notation, simply as a C major chord. Okay, so in the first example, I have the C major triad in a very closed position. In the second example, they're the same three notes, C, C, E, G, but now it sounds much different. I could voice it many different ways. Okay. So this is a form that we call four-part writing. So where does this come from, four-part writing? It comes from the idea that music can be sung. So if you've ever sung in a choir before or in a church, then you'll be familiar with hymns. And in hymns, we always have four parts. A soprano line, which is the highest, an alto line, a tenor line, and a bass voice. So those are our four voices: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Soprano and alto will be written on the treble staff, whereas tenor and bass will be written on the bass staff typically. That's how we'll be doing it, just on the grand staff. So let's talk about registration. Registration refers to basically the range of an instrument. Okay, in this context, we're talking about the range of a particular voice. So let's start with the soprano voice. Soprano voice, maybe I should change these colors so that they're color-coded. Let's make alto red. We'll make the tenor green. And we'll make the bass pink. So soprano range. Okay. So as far as the soprano voice is concerned, the extremities of the range is really from about C4 to C6. And honestly, this is pretty extreme. Okay. Usually, you're going to want to keep this more along the lines of, say, E to G. This is a much more comfortable range for the soprano voice. And even so, you want to stay away from the extremes most of the time. Okay. For the alto voice, the low extremity is, say, a G3, and up to maybe an E5, somewhere in that range. And again, you want to stay well within their comfort zone. So a more realistic range would be, say, maybe going from B to, say, C or something like that. Okay. Notice there's overlap. For the tenor voice is from C3, C3 and up to probably maybe G4, maybe G4. Tenors, there are tenors who can sing higher as well, but I would say that this is about where you want to keep yourselves limited to. And again, usually staying well within the safe range. And for the bass, maybe D2, that's getting kind of low. And I would say somewhere up to maybe a D4. But realistically, you're going to want to keep it well within this range, say F to maybe middle C. So these are the comfortable registers for each of these voice parts. Now, soprano, alto, tenor, bass refers to voices as in singers, but these are ranges that work for instrument classes as well. So for example, you have soprano class instruments like the flute, right? Like the piccolo, the violin, many instruments, even an oboe, clarinet goes in soprano range, soprano sax. You have alto range instruments. Clarinet also sits in the alto range. The viola sits in the alto range. Okay, so there are classifications of instruments that kind of follow these voicings, although usually instruments have their own peculiarities when it comes to registration. Okay, so for now we're thinking more from a vocal perspective. So what does this mean? This means when we're notating a chord, we want to kind of place the notes within these registers, within the vocal ranges. So for example, let's say that we're writing a C major triad. Okay? So let's say I give my bass voice a C, and I'm going to do stem down to indicate that it's bass. And let's say that I give my tenor a G, stem up. Let's say that my alto is an E, stem down, and my soprano is a C, stem up. Okay? Each of these notes are well within the range of each of the voices. And it sounds pretty good. It sounds pretty balanced. So now that you understand vocal registrations or voice registrations, let's talk a little bit about balance. Okay. So when you're writing the voices, obviously it's going to sound very different if we write a bunch of notes close together down here, close together up here. Okay, so notice in my example I kind of space things out to make it sort of balanced. So what are some things to be aware of? Okay, here's a rule. The lower the notes, the more distance you need. The lower the notes, the more distance you need between the voices. Okay? You should write your music almost like a pyramid structure, where the lowest voices are furthest apart, and then the highest voices are closest apart. Why is this? It's because that's kind of how it works. So if you take a look at my hands on the piano here, if I play a third, say, in the middle of the piano, that's still pretty easy to hear. You can hear the separation of notes very clearly. But if I play the same third 2 octaves lower, take a listen. That's very muddy now. It's almost indiscernible at that registration. Now if I do a second, you can imagine how unclear that is. But if I do a second up here, still very clear. Okay, the notes are very distinct. Even a half step, we can hear very clearly. Okay? So general rule, when you are below C3, okay, you should have the distance preferably of at least an octave between the bass and tenor voices. At least an octave. Okay, all of that's good. You could do a fifth, but it's pretty muddied. Now, if you are between the notes of C3 and C4, then you should have anything of a fourth or larger. Fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, all work. Octave here works as well. Okay? This is for any instruments. Okay? This is not just for singers. This is if you're writing an orchestral suite, it doesn't matter. So below C3, you're going to need like an octave or more. C3 to C4, you can get away with a fourth. A fourth here, still pretty clear. Fourth here, not clear anymore. Once you are above C4, now you can do anything. Seconds, thirds, all of that works. Okay? What this means is when you're voicing, oftentimes the lower voices will have more distance. Say, for example, a tenth, C, E, and maybe these voices are closer. You might have something that looks like this. Bass, tenor, alto, soprano. Notice how much distance is between the bass and the tenor. And notice how close the upper three voices are. But it still works. Tonally, it works very well. If I did the opposite, it's just not nearly as pleasant. Much better, much clearer. We can hear the voices very distinctly. Okay. So now that we understand that, on the next video, we're going to talk about how to select voices to, in triads and seventh chords when you're writing for four voices. Okay. So we're going to take a look at that in depth. I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.